All right, everyone, buckle up because today's deep dive is going to get interesting.
Oh, yeah.
We're wading into the wild world of online forums to unpack some, well, let's just say passionate takes on Marxism.
Sounds like fun.
Our source, a user going by Thomas777. And let me tell you, this isn't your college syllabus Marxism.
Definitely not. So what's got Thomas riled up?
From the jump, he makes this really bold claim. He's saying Marxism, as an ideology, it only really made sense historically in the context of Europe modernizing, right?
Interesting.
Not some kind of universal blueprint
right.
that you can just slap onto any society.
Yeah, it's a crucial point. You think about how differently, say, attempts to implement Marxist ideals played out in a place like North Korea.
Oh, for sure.
Versus Cambodia.
Totally different outcomes.
Yeah, often tragic, right. It's precisely because those cultural and historical contexts were just completely different from Europe's.
He actually calls Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia nonsense.
Wow.
He's like, that wasn't even real Marxism.
Yeah.
More like just pure Stalinist control.
Right.
And then there's his take on Chinese communism, which Thomas777 argues is, less about ideology and more like a playbook for China on the world stage.
A strategic tool more than anything.
Exactly. Are they really strict commies? Or is it more about, advancing China's interests, whatever those are at the time? What do you think?
I mean, it's a really nuanced point.
Yeah.
While China obviously uses the language of communism.
For sure.
And there's some economic structures that resemble it. Their approach is, in a lot of ways, much more pragmatic, right? Much more self-serving than, say, purely ideological.
Yeah.
He even says America, for example, with, our whole thing about individualism, personal liberty, that'd be fundamentally resistant to pure Marxism.
So even nations with Western roots, not necessarily fertile ground for that kind of ideology to take hold.
It seems like, at least according to Thomas.
All right. Now let's dig into a term that gets thrown around a lot these days, and that's cultural Marxism.
Oh, boy.
Thomas777, he basically says figures like, what's his name, Pat Buchanan,
right,
way off base with how they use it.
Yeah, this is one of those where really understanding the context of Marx's work historically is so vital, right? When Marx himself was writing about culture, what was he actually looking at? He was analyzing how the dominant economic system at that time influenced art, literature, ideas,
Right.
But cultural Marxism, at least as it's used today, has become this kind of catch-all, right?
Totally.
For anything perceived as threatening traditional values or,
Yeah, it's like this boogeyman now.
It's completely detached from what Marx was actually talking about.
Okay, but here's where it gets even more interesting. Thomas777, he uses East Germany as his, prime example of pure Marxist culture.
Okay, interesting.
And he paints a very specific picture. He's talking about a society where labor is valued above all else, military strength, anything that seems like, disruptive innovation, viewed with suspicion.
So he's saying if you want to see what a society shaped by strict Marxist principles actually looks like, look at historical examples like East Germany, not at, the social and cultural shifts we're seeing in Western societies today.
Okay, so he's drawing a line there. And then he does this other thing, which I thought was really interesting. He's got this whole list. Feminism, affirmative action, open borders, things that often get labeled socialist.
Right.
But he sees them as separate from what he considers true Marxist goals.
So he's making a distinction between traditional Marxist goals, which were all about, economic equality, right?
And fully dismantling those systems.
Dismantling capitalism, and then these other movements that he kind of lumps in more with liberalism, maybe.
He's drawing a line in the sand there. But I don't know, doesn't that ignore how much those things can, overlap, influence each other? Right?
Yeah, for sure. It's worth thinking about whether these rigid categories, do they actually help us understand the real world? Or are they, more of a distraction?
And he doesn't let up, by the way. Thomas777 goes on to say that a lot of folks who are out there decrying cultural Marxism, he thinks they're being a tad hypocritical.
Oh.
Because according to him, they'd have been perfectly happy in the super rigid authoritarian societies of the Eastern Bloc back in the day.
That's a bold statement.
Is he implying that the people who are so scared of cultural Marxism today, maybe they've got more in common with old school Marxist Leninist regimes than they realize.
It's an interesting thought.
And he gets really specific. He brings up East Germany, like we were talking about, how during the Cold War, they had this whole propaganda thing going on,
right,
where they try to paint America as this like super racist, oppressive place,
right,
while totally downplaying their own issues.
Classic deflection.
He even mentions like East German officials basically acting like, quote, Prussian overlords in places like South Yemen.
Wow.
Which doesn't exactly scream dedicated to the oppressed, you know?
Not really.
So it's this disconnect between the image and the reality. He seems especially, I don't know, maybe even scornful is the right word, of what he calls intellectually lazy professors at, you guessed it, Berkeley, who are, in his words, obsessed with identity politics. He thinks they've totally missed the point of Marx. What's his argument there?
It seems like, for him, there's this huge gap between, like, the lived reality of a society actually structured around Marxist principles, like take East Germany again, versus what he sees as more like theoretical armchair discussions of cultural Marxism happening in, certain Western academic circles.
Not the ivory tower.
Exactly. It's like he thinks these academics are playing intellectual games that have very little to do with how Marxist theory actually played out in the real world.
So the grit of East Berlin versus the theorizing of certain departments at certain universities.
Yeah, and in the process, he paints this very specific and kind of loaded picture of Marxism itself, right?
Yeah.
He calls it masculine authoritarian, implicitly violent, autocratic, militaristic, and overwhelmingly white. And while, sure, you could argue that fits some historical context, it definitely ignores a lot of the diversity within the broader Marxist tradition.
Yeah, for sure. So he's acknowledging that Marxist ideas have been used to justify some really bad things, right? But he's also saying, hey, don't go throwing that Marxist label on everything you don't like.
Exactly. And that leads to a really crucial question. If these traditional Marxist goals, they're distinct from the social and cultural movements we see today, and if those 20th century Marxist regimes, they were so flawed, then what's left? What is Marx's legacy?
Which brings us to his whole Marxism's ghost idea, right?
Right. He's not talking about specific policies here. It's deeper than that. It's about how we view power, equality, the role of the state, even if we don't realize that's where those views came from.
He actually compares Stalin to Genghis Khan, which is kind of a wild comparison when you think about it.
It is.
But both of those figures, they held this undeniable sway over people despite, being incredibly brutal.
Right. And it gets at this question that I think continues to fascinate us, right? Why are humans so drawn to strongmen, even when those strongmen represent values that we claim to reject?
It's like, is there something about power itself that's just inherently seductive no matter how it's used? And if so, does that mean even the best intentions, even the most righteous revolution can get twisted into something else?
It's kind of chilling when you think about it. Is it possible that wanting a more just society, a goal that a lot of people associate with, Marxist ideals, could it actually lead to new forms of tyranny? It makes you think about power itself, right? Does it always corrupt in the end, no matter what?
It really challenges that whole utopian vision that drew so many people to Marxism in the first place, right? This idea of a classless society. But if revolution, even a successful one, if it can still end up creating another form of oppression, then where does that leave us?
It's something that Thomas777 seems to be wrestling with himself. He's really clear about the flaws of capitalism. He even calls it, quote, horseshit.
Right. Strong words.
But he also sees major problems with pure Marxist analysis. It's almost like he's saying, hey, these systems we've got, they're both messed up.
Yeah.
But then he doesn't give us the answer,
So if capitalism's horseshit and the traditional Marxist answers are also, as he puts it, horseshit, then what? Do we need, totally new models, new ways of even thinking about how society should work?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It might mean moving past that old left-right capitalist socialist way of seeing things altogether. Maybe there's something else out there, something more nuanced that could actually deal with inequality and power.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around, but that's the whole point of these deep dives, right? We're not just giving you the SparkNotes version of something. We're really trying to dig into these complex ideas, challenge ourselves, and hopefully get you thinking in new ways, too.
And that's especially important with someone like Thomas777, right? What we get from him is just that it's his perspective. He's got his own experiences, his own biases, his own way of interpreting things. The point isn't to just agree or disagree, but to really engage with what he's saying critically.
Take what resonates, maybe question what doesn't, and use it all as a jumping off point for your own exploration. I think the most important thing is to never be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. Have those tough conversations, even when they get a little uncomfortable.
Couldn't agree more, especially these days when we're just bombarded with information from every direction. Being able to think for yourself, figure out what's true, what's opinion, and talk to people who see things differently, that's more important than ever.
Absolutely. So if there's one takeaway from our deep dive into the world of Thomas777 and his take on Marxism, it's this. Keep those questions coming, keep looking for those different perspectives, and never stop thinking critically. Until next time, everyone, thanks for joining us.